Hi, welcome to the lecture for Module 5, Understanding Students with Emotional Behavior Disorders. This lecture in particular will provide an overview of EBD and teaching strategies that assist teachers in decreasing negative behavior episodes while increasing academic progress and success. There are two articles that we'll focus in on. The first article, The Impact of Social Interaction on Educational Outcomes for Learners with Emotional and Behavioral Disabilities, and then the other one, Evidence-Based Teaching Strategies for Students with EBD. There are two resources that I think will be worth looking at, 5 tips for handling EBD kids, emotional behavior disorder in an inclusive classroom, and then truth in labeling disproportionality and special education. So the first, let me just show you the first resource that we have. Really quickly is this one here. So this one is it's a report of all the studies that have been done on students that have who are in special needs inclusive settings, and it discusses research on these particular settings and things that teachers can do from the environmental aspect to increase students' abilities to be successful if they are challenged with a learning disability. So it goes over the literature, theories related to inclusion. It also talks about observational learning theory, guided learning theory, a review of literature on inclusive education overall, and then it goes into some useful tips. The last one I think was a little bit more useful in that it provides a actual chart of class-wide of intervention strategies, and I actually added one to the end that I've learned through my community work that I did 2 years back with the UNLV and my mentor, who created a program to decrease issues that particularly African American females have within school settings, working alongside a alternative school area. So let's get into it. I will say that a lot of how we interact with students who have EBD has more to do with our interpretation of their disability and challenge with it, and less to do with their actual disability. A lot of times I've heard in situations where the student has an emotional challenge, teachers don't know how to respond correctly, or they're just not using the tools. So remember that students with emotional and behavioral disorders or severely emotional disorders have behaviors that inhibit them academically as well as socially. Oftentimes, they don't actually know that they're acting out. And I think that's the misconception that educators can sometimes have, because they see them as a kid, a normal kid, but they don't realize when someone they do not have the capacity nor the ability to understand their behaviors, then it's not a sign of them acting out. It's literally them having a challenge with their disability and not having the coping skills to deal with it. So moreover, there are frequently sometimes educators have deemed them as too disruptive in the general education classroom, and oftentimes asked for separation. However, with the laws that regulate our classrooms today, separation is not an option. So, and neither should it have been. Studies have shown despite these dismissal academic outcomes, the majority of interventions conducted with these children have focused primarily on behavior modification, often neglecting the glaring academic deficiencies that they developed. So what has happened over the course, I would say, of 20, 30 years, 3 things have been evident. Number one, there's a disproportionality of minoritized students within the categorization of students who are labeled as EBD. And then number two, The behaviors that are seen, especially if it's EBD, are not actually being monitored in the way in which that supports the student's growth socially, and then academically they're falling behind because the focus is on the disability and not their ability, just because they're emotionally challenged. As in, this is their challenge, this is their disability. It does not mean that they're not able to learn. It's just that they will be in need of assistance and also guidance in figuring out how to both cope and adjust so that they are able to successfully complete assignments and not become overwhelmed or be anxious. And no, this is not me, by the way. So, what I'm going to also say is that I often find that teachers are overwhelmed, and I didn't realize until I'm going to say Monday, where I had a student who had missed about 3 or 4 days, and she communicated to me she has extreme emotional challenges where she has to take medication, and when she gets overwhelmed, she can't be at school because she has fits where she can't stop crying and can't stop dealing with her emotions. So I didn't think about it until that day that my niece struggled with some of the same challenges, but she was just able to cope better within a normal environment. When kids are diagnosed with emotional behavior disorder, the label itself sometimes carries a weight. That means that they have to be in a separate area. And when they are in regular classrooms, sometimes instead of focusing on the strategies, we focus on the actual student. I'm going to caution you against that because strategy does work if it's employed. And the way in which we can support our students when they are emotionally disturbed, or if they're having an episode, or if they're severely emotionally impaired, we can actually use strategies to enable them to do better in the classroom so that they're not automatically just sent out and suspended or sent out into a separate area or even isolated within a classroom. So I do think that students need a little bit more of showing of what the expectation is. And I think as educators, it's a little bit more of a challenge to do this. So for one, class-wide peer tutoring. So this is going into how do we promote social and also academic growth. Using the students' peers if they're able to be in a type of arrangement, a grouping in class where they could receive that would be awesome. Doing cooperative learning strategies can also be great because it is inclusive for everyone within the classroom. Cross-age tutoring. If there was ever when I was a kid, there was a partnership where students who were at a higher grade came down to tutor the students who are at a lower grade. If that's possible in your school, you can also try some peer tutoring, as well as peer assisted learning strategies. So when you're doing your group flexibility, if you have a student who's emotional behavior challenged or severely behavior challenged, you could possibly have them work alongside someone who can demonstrate those skills in a successful way. While doing their work. So for example, if they get frustrated, they won't throw their desk, they'll just take a deep breath and kind of work through it. Peer assessments, which can work to a certain extent, peer modeling, and then peer reinforcement. The article did not talk about the last one here, which is code switching. So one of the things I noticed is that a lot of times students have a difficult time recognizing the behaviors that are expected from them when they are in school. So the reason why I said recognizing behaviors that are expected is that when a student comes from a different background or they have a different understanding of what social norms are, and if they haven't been trained well at home, then especially to cope with those behavior challenges, they won't understand what the expectations are. So you would have to then explain to them very clearly, in class, we do not throw our pencils when we get mad at the test. In our class, we do not scream and cry when we don't like something we hear. And reinforcing that repetitively might help them. Teaching them the difference between location, because the truth of the matter is that you can't always control what happens to a student when they go home. It would be ideal and dreamlike if every student was getting therapy and was working with someone, a specialist, to help them deal with the emotional behavior disorders that they may have. However, in the real world, a lot of parents can't afford that. So teaching students that the behavior that they need to exhibit is associated with an activity or with the environment can be crucial to their success. So, for example, social behaviors. When we're at school, we're being with our friends, we do not hit our friends. Cueing them with signs and symbols that show them how to switch their behavior. Code switching refers to the ability, especially with students who are of color, who can identify expected behaviors while being themselves in a classroom. So teaching the student, these are the expectations, this is who you are, and then how do we bridge to get to an equal point. These things are important. All of these geared towards modeling and reinforcement as a collective. And I think for EBD especially, as educators, it's so important that we are not the trigger causers. So for example, I'm not going to say I'm proud of this, but I had a student, and this is the last thing I'll say before I wrap this up. I had a student who was emotionally, he had a behavior disability where he had a problem with authority, and I didn't realize what that actually meant until I already wrapped myself up. So one day he turned in his midterm late, and I didn't think about it. It was still in my mailbox. I went on with the day. This was years ago. And then in class, he confronted me about this situation and said, well, you didn't even grade my midterm. And I tried to explain to him, you turned it in on a Friday after school was over, and he was not with it. So after a couple of words were exchanged, he became defiant, and I had to send him out. And when I think about that conversation, I think about all the different ways I could have handled it. I could have probably used some other intervention skills. I could have possibly not continued the conversation to trigger him any further. Because what ended up happening was he had to get sent out of my classroom. He still didn't learn the behavior that he should have. And then the threat then turned into him using a person that he knew at the school to try to push his way through to getting the answer to his midterm. And then I thought about the situation. I said, as educators, it is a challenge to deal with students with emotional behavior disturbances or behavioral disabilities. However, it's very important that we recognize their triggers and recognize in what ways that we can support them and really understand what it means when they do have an emotional behavior disability and how to support that. So, to wrap up this lecture with this week, please remember to read all the directions for the project, the midterm project. It should be pretty simple, as we've done a lot of these with this class or with this cohort. The group collaborative activity, the discussion board, is just a great little conversation following a video for us to explore different ways that we can improve the way in which we serve our students with disabilities. I hope you have a fantastic week, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. As soon as I get some of your midterms, I will give feedback. I only have one now, so that's the one I'm going to focus in on. Hopefully the rest of them will come in on Sunday. Have a fantastic week.